The Finance Minister Arun Jaitley will have to choose between one, keeping his word versus maintaining fiscal prudence, and two, animal spirits versus equitable tax policy. Now, Menka, let's hear out all the arguments for and against the corporate tax cut.
Okay, so for is this, he made this promise in 2015. That's what he stood up and said in his speech in 2015. And he has already partially implemented the promise, which is to say, the promise was this, that he wanted a simpler tax system, a tax system that helped business do business and not get involved in litigation in tax, a tax system that involved lower rates and fewer or almost no exemptions or deductions. That was the broad mandate that he put out there, right? So the first thing that he wanted was the 2015 promise. The first thing in favor of a tax cut is the 2015 promise that he made. The second thing is the partial implementation that he's already done, which is to say that we already saw some deductions and exemptions start falling off April 1st, 2017. And we've already seen a headline tax rate cut for small enterprises. So the tax rate went from the statutory rate of 30% to 25% for those firms that do an annual turnover of 50 crore rupees or less. So a partial implementation has already taken place. The third reason for why he may consider doing or, undertaking a tax cut is because corporate India keeps complaining that we pay a very high tax rate. And there may be some truth in that. Let me give you some comparative numbers there. So at about 33%, so that's the 30% headline rate plus cess, surcharge, all of that. We compare rather poorly with China's 31%, Russia's 24%. And according to EY data, if you add the dividend distribution tax, which is also a tax on your distribution of earnings, then effective rate, including surcharge, etc., comes up to 55% because our dividend distribution tax is 15% and it's taxed at the hands of the company. So 55%, it puts India, as you can see on that chart on your screen, at pole position in terms of the number of countries and their tax rate. So we at 55% are much ahead of the US at 43%, which was before their tax reform, and Brazil at 34%. The US has since then reduced or promised to reduce its tax rate to about 21% from the statutory number. So this is the argument that industry has been making, saying if you want to remain competitive, if you want to draw foreign investment, if you want Indian companies to invest here, then you must form or create a competitive tax scenario and hence reduce the rate. Okay. The fourth bit is animal spirits. We've known that private investment hasn't picked up much, and therefore I think one of the arguments being made, and it was made right here on this table by Rashesh Shah, the president of FICCI and the head of the Edelweiss Group, is that retained earnings are, sort of very important to be able to do future investments. A cut in tax will help build retained earnings for companies, and therefore it is prudent for the finance minister to consider this, despite the fact that he has many other spending priorities. So those are the four key reasons for why the tax rate should be cut or could be cut. Those are the arguments in favor. Let's look at the arguments against, because I quite favor those. Who benefits from a tax rate cut? Okay. Now, mostly in India, we've seen it's shareholders who benefit because companies are able to, sort of report higher profits. That means higher share prices. And that means that a fairly small community of people in this country, a couple of percentage of people in this country, actually benefit from a tax rate cut. Now, just contrast that to the kind of transmission we've seen happen in the US right after they announced a tax rate cut from their, 30% to 21%. 70 companies and more, okay, and these are top-line companies. I'm only looking at the very big ones. 70 companies and more have either announced an immediate one-time bonus for their employees, or some have decided to distribute this tax benefit through restricted stock options. Others have also commensurately increased their minimum wages. So all of this has happened within the 3-4 weeks of a tax cut being announced and legislated. Immediate transmission to a much wider stakeholder community. Can Indian corporates promise us that? Can they ensure that this will get passed on, not just to shareholders, but to employees through hiring, through better wages, through bonuses, things like that, right? So I think you have to look at who is benefiting, and you have to look at that in the backdrop of the debate that's been going on for the last 2 years, that, you know, there has been an unequal distribution of benefits or gains of economic growth across economies. So in our economy as well, we need to consider that. The second thing is the indirect tax to GDP ratio is already very high in this country. Now, an equitable tax policy would effectively mean higher direct tax contribution to tax revenues and lower indirect tax contribution, because indirect tax, as you know, is paid by everybody. Even the poorest of poor, when they buy a packet of biscuits, end up paying indirect tax, whereas only the rich or the well-off end up shouldering the burden of direct tax much more. If you look at the numbers, in 2000-2001, the percentage of direct tax as a percentage of total tax revenue was 36%. It went to a peak of 60% or 61% almost in 2009-2010. It's now come down to about 50% in 2016-2017. So 50% of our tax revenue comes from direct tax, 50% comes from indirect tax. That's not a good ratio. It's a very inequitable ratio. So if you keep reducing the direct tax contribution, you're putting more burden on indirect tax, and that is not fair. So that's the third or the second reason for why you should not cut corporate tax rates. And the third one is that, look, Iras just pointed out, he already has enough spending priorities, right? He needs to do something to help the beleaguered rural sector, the SME sector, the agricultural sector. So he has to choose between who he wants to help, the large corporations or the smaller ones. I'll end with a quote from none other than the chief economic advisor, who in an interview with Ira and I said, look, there are already enough things that the government needs to do this year. You know, just simplify GST, make sure that agenda works properly, support agriculture and agricultural prices, privatize Air India, complete all the resolution efforts when it comes to IBC. And then he goes on to say, I'm warning against the kind of temptation that says you need to do more and more. In effect, he said, when he was responding to a question on do you need to cut corporate tax rates. There's a lot which is being done. Finishing those things will bring back animal spirits along with a cooperative world economy. And so that's the last word coming from the CEA. He himself did not seem to be in favor of a corporate tax rate cut. So that concludes the arguments against.
I'm going to add one quick word to it, a data point that came yesterday. I mean, nobody's saying that there are animal spirits in the
core
economy.
Sector.
Not the core sector, the revised numbers for previous GDP years. And I don't know if my producer Panchmi has that data ready. But it essentially changed the expenditure side data, which tells you that in capital formation, you did about 7.2% growth in 15-16, 4.1 in 16-17. And the advanced estimates of 17-18 suggest 4.5%, which will get revised higher, because 16-17 have been revised lower. So if you actually look at that, it's not like we've been devoid of investment. Gross fixed capital formation hasn't been, clearly at the levels of 2007, etc., or even 2010 to 12. But it's not like it's negative.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
also, I think just to add to that point, I don't think we'll ever go back to the levels of 2005, 6, 7. And we know what the outcomes of those levels are. We're seeing so many projects stuck in our unviable situations at this point in time, right? Yeah. So I think everybody who has spoken to us has concluded that private investment will probably never take the shape and form that it did in the last decade. 100. It will be a more muted number in the years to come. It will probably be a different structural, sort of pattern. So, yeah, I don't know if he needs to cut rates to support animal spirits. I don't know. But this is the balanced, sort of reasons pro and, against any corporate tax rate. Of course, only Arun Jaitley knows if he's going to go ahead and cut it or not.